The story of Cain and Abel is fairly well known to a lot of us who grew up in and around churches, and it's become one of those cultural stories where even someone who wasn't born in and around churches tends to know a little bit about that story. I'm going to read the remainder of that story in just a moment, but first we're going to share some remarks. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, as we listen for your word in this ancient story, give us eyes to see and give us ears to hear what your Spirit is saying to your church today. Amen. So many of us grew up hearing the story of Cain and Abel, and it's an intriguing story for many reasons, not the least of which is because if you follow the story, we're one generation into the human story, and already we have a murder on our hands. We have 4 people in the world. One of them kills the other. You know, you could say that this is genocide with 25% of humanity being killed. I mean, it's like that. So let me just begin by saying right off the bat that it probably does not assist us in any way to read this story literally, because it doesn't really quite work. If you read the story literally, you've got Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, and somehow Cain marries somebody. I don't know who. And somehow Cain is worried that somebody's going to take vengeance on him, which, if you follow the story, would only be Adam and Eve. And it seems like God could just call them together and say, hey, don't take vengeance on Cain. And they'd say, okay, job done. So it's not a story that can be read literally, or otherwise it gets a little contorted. But it is a story that just has a ton of powerful meaning to it. And it's a story that biblical communities have just wrestled with for years and years, trying to understand its meaning. Because in some ways you could interpret it as a cultural story. And when I read the remainder of the story later, you're going to see that that's exactly what the biblical writer is doing with the story. He's explaining the evolution of various cultures. So you could see it as a contention between the agricultural communities and the livestock communities, and some of their mutual suspicions of one another. Later we're going to read how Cain went off and built a city. So you could read it as a story about the nomadic people versus the city dwellers, because the city dwellers could stockpile weapons. The nomadic folks simply didn't have the wherewithal to carry something, that kind of weaponry, so they were always at a disadvantage. Could be a reading of that. And there's an intriguing reference in the story to the mark of Cain. The mark of Cain. Nobody really knows what that is. I happen to think it's that sticker you get when you donate blood. And it says, be nice to me, I shed blood today. But I'm not sure if I'm right on that one. Some people have interpreted the mark of Cain as actually in a very racial way. And it's caused a lot of problems for the church throughout the years. St. Augustine interpreted this story as Cain being a typology of the Jews. And he argued that whereas they did kill Jesus, God in God's mercy tells us not to kill them. And that also is a very unfortunate interpretation that has led to many, many problems for Christian-Jewish relationships over the years. So it's an intriguing story, and it's a violent story, which is why I actually cut the first reading off a little shorter than I had originally intended to, because all these children were sitting on the steps looking at me, and I just kind of couldn't go there. And it's a tough story to hear. But it's a story that has some tremendous meaning. And what I would invite you to do today is not to hear it simply as a story of a sibling rivalry. I think that's how we normally hear it in Sunday school lessons and sermons, that Cain and Abel were brothers, they just couldn't get along, and one thing led to another. It turned violent, got really ugly really quickly. And then God punished Cain. And so we typically hear it as an episode of law and order. And if you walk through the story, it kind of works that way. First, you have Cain, who takes Abel out into a field, kind of a desolate place, and that's where the murder happens. Law and order always begins with someone who thinks they've gotten away with it. And that's Cain. He thinks he's kind of committed this heinous murder in a place where no one can see it. And then God comes on the scene, and God is kind of the investigator and the crime lab person and the judge all wrapped in one, the prosecutor as well. Because God comes on the scene and he asks Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And like every single guilty person ever, Cain's first response is, "I didn't do it," right? Or rather, he asks God the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Putting it back on God as if he's clean of the situation. But here's when the evidentiary witness is introduced. Because God says to Cain, "What have you done? Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." Now, this is a really intriguing thing for these ancient communities to say in this story, because it gives us a sense that someone's life is not over when they die, when they're killed. It's almost the same thing, the same notion behind haunted houses, right? When someone dies in a way that's unjust or wrong, you have a sense that there's unfinished business going on. That's similar to what happens in this story, where God says Abel's blood is crying out from the ground. It's not this passive substance, but rather it's the accusing evidence that Cain has done a horrible thing. And so God finds Cain guilty and then issues a punishment that fits the crime. And the punishment is, the ground will no longer yield to you. He cannot be the agriculturalist that he was, but rather he becomes a nomad. And he has to leave the area and wander the earth. So to this point, it really does sound like a scene out of Law and Order, CSI, one of those great TV shows, right? Where you have the accusation, he's found guilty, and he's punished in a way that fits the crime. But it's not an episode of Law and Order, because something new happens here. Cain cries out to God, "This punishment is more than I can bear. Because if I wander the earth, then whoever finds me will take vengeance on me for what I did to Abel." In other words, Cain is crying out for mercy. No longer saying, "I'm not guilty," no longer saying, "I'm not my brother's keeper," but rather saying, "I can't bear the consequences, the justice that you have issued to me." And this is where it becomes a story very unlike Law and Order and very unlike the way we do justice. Because God becomes the hero here by mingling mercy with justice. So as we begin our series on heroes and villains, I want us to see how God is depicted in this story as a hero, because it's a story that identifies what true justice is by putting it in God's actions. And true justice is when mercy and justice are found together. Because justice without mercy is simple vengeance. And a mercy without justice is permissiveness. But in this story, Cain is guilty, and he is punished, and he does receive justice, but the justice is tempered by mercy. And it's a story that tells the people of God that that's how we are to define justice. So we start to imagine to ourselves, what would it be like to experience justice apart from mercy? And that's where the rest of the story feeds us. And that's where we see how God is the hero, but Lamech is the villain. That's the part of the story none of us read in Sunday school. That's the part of the story most of us don't even realize is there. But it's the Cain story finished up throughout the 4th chapter of Genesis. So with your indulgence, let me read the whole story for you. I'll start with the part that Kennedy and I have already presented. Now Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, God had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out into the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where's your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will become a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. And I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a 7-fold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and named it Enoch after his son Enoch. And to Enoch was born Irad, and to Irad was the father of Mehuel, and Mehuel was the father of Methushael. Methushael was the father of Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives. The name of one was Adah, the other was Zillah. Adah bore Jabal. He was the ancestor of all those who live in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal, and he was the ancestor of all of those who play the lyre and the pipe. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another child instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. And to Seth was born a son. He named him Enosh. And at that time, people began to invoke the name of the Lord. So what do we hear when we hear the rest of the story? Not just the sibling rivalry, where Cain and Abel are out in the field and Cain gets jealous and rises up and kills his brother. But it's a story where God finds Cain guilty, exiles him as a matter of justice, but then as a matter of mercy, pronounces nobody can take vengeance on Cain, lest they be avenged 7-fold. It's a marvelous depiction of justice with mercy. Then we hear the story of Lamech. Did you hear the words of Lamech? he calls his two wives and says, listen to what I say. I have killed a man, not just a man, but a young man, for striking me. Now this was the kind of action that was tempered later by the law of retaliation. That said, a tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, instead of, if you take the tooth of a powerful man, he can just kill you because he feels like it. Okay, so that law of retaliation, once upon a time, was a merciful law to try to temper this action of might makes right. But at this point in the history and in the story, Lamech killed a young man for striking him, put him to death. And then Lamech says something that sounds almost exactly like what God said. God said, anyone who takes vengeance on Cain will be avenged sevenfold. Lamech says, anybody that tries to take vengeance on me is going to suffer 77-fold. Almost what God said. In some respects, Lamech becomes the earth's first politician. Almost what God said. Sounds kind of gaudy, doesn't it? What Lamech said. And when you almost say what God says, you usually have to thump your chest and say it really loudly, because you're missing the point and you're taking God's name in vain for your own purposes. So when we hear the story of Cain and Abel, and we hear it not so much as a story of sibling rivalry, but a story of God the hero and Lamech the arrogant, it speaks to us in our moment. Because did you know that in the United States, over 2,200 young people aged 17 and younger have been sentenced to life in prison with no chance for parole? No chance for parole. Imagine that. Age 17 and younger. You have to be about 13 to be tried as an adult. So we're talking about a span between ages 13 and 17. Several dozen of those young people are 13, 14 years old when they commit the crime. And they're sentenced to life in prison with no chance. No chance for parole. Just hold that for a moment. Imagine what you thought when you were 13 and 14. Imagine the things you did. Imagine the things you almost did. Imagine the things you would have done if the situation had been a little bit different. Imagine at that age being taken to prison for the rest of your life, and there's no recourse. And it's not because there are a couple of bad judges out there just kind of pumping their fists and so forth. The judges typically don't have discretion on this. It's a series of laws that have been put into place. Laws that somebody has put on the books and then gone home to a town hall meeting and said, I am tough on crime. And all the people said, yay, I will vote for you again. And we're pandering to people's fear. And we're putting these laws into place so that by the time the judge is facing a 13-year-old who has committed a crime, and in some respects a heinous crime, just like Cain's crime was heinous, then all the judge has left is mercy, but not justice. And as a result, 2,200 people, 17 and younger, will spend the entirety of their lives in prison. There's no appeal. There's no parole hearing. There's no chance for parole. So by the time they're 25 and they start figuring it out, it doesn't matter. By the time they're 34 and have spent more than half of their life in prison, they've only just begun. By the time they're 50 and a little bit of gray hair and perhaps some accompanying wisdom starts to kick in, it doesn't matter. By the time they're 80 and may have a life full of regret, not a single one of those regrets matters, because we have satisfied our urges to be tough on crime, to do justice without mercy. When we read the story of God the hero and Lamech the villain, it calls us out. And it invites us to get busy. To get busy in looking at the books. I'm talking to the attorneys here. Get busy in telling us what we ought to be doing to try to shift this system. I'm talking about donors here to get busy in getting people in place who are going to fix those laws that are on. I'm talking to people with a voice. Because this story challenges us that if we really want to be a people who follow God's justice, we will not divorce justice from mercy. Because true justice finds its fulfillment when it is mingled with mercy. May God give us the courage to be heroes of justice. Amen.